Judge humiliates Black Widow in court. Then her lawyer makes a shocking reveal. Esmeralda Jackson stood before Judge Thomas Caldwell, her hands trembling as she clutched a faded photograph of her late husband, Marcus. The courtroom's oppressive silence weighed heavily on her shoulders, a stark contrast to the chaos of emotions swirling within her. She blinked back tears, determined to maintain her composure in the face of the stern-faced judge who regarded her with thinly veiled disdain. "Mrs. Jackson," Judge Caldwell drawled, his voice dripping with condescension, "I understand you're seeking damages from Titan Corp for the unfortunate accident involving your husband. Please enlighten us as to why you believe this company owes you anything." Esmeralda swallowed hard, her throat constricting. She glanced at the opposing counsel, Mr. Davis, whose shark-like grin sent a chill down her spine. Gathering her courage, she began to speak. "Your Honor, my husband Marcus was a good man, a loving father to our children, Maya and David. He was crossing the street when a Titan Corp truck ran a red light, and—" Judge Caldwell cut her off with a dismissive wave. Yes, we've all read the police report. What I'm asking is why you think this warrants a lawsuit. Accidents happen, Mrs. Jackson. It's a tragedy, certainly, but hardly grounds for legal action." Esmeralda's fingers tightened around the photograph, her knuckles turning white. "Your Honor, there's evidence suggesting the truck's brakes were faulty. Titan Corp knew about this issue and chose to ignore it. My husband's death wasn't just an accident. It was the result of negligence." Mr. Davis leapt to his feet, his expensive suit rustling. "Objection, Your Honor. These are baseless accusations. Mrs. Jackson has no proof to support her claims." Sustained. Judge Caldwell nodded, barely glancing at Esmeralda. "Mrs. Jackson, I must warn you against making unfounded allegations in my courtroom." Esmeralda's cheeks burned with a mixture of shame and indignation. She opened her mouth to protest, but Judge Caldwell silenced her with a stern look. "Furthermore," he continued, his tone growing increasingly irritated, "I find it hard to believe that this lawsuit is motivated by anything other than financial gain. Your husband's death, while regrettable, does not entitle you to a payout from a respected corporation." The words hit Esmeralda like a physical blow. She stumbled back, her vision blurring with unshed tears. "Your Honor, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This isn't about money. I'm about to lose our home. My children." "Oh, spare us the sob story," Judge Caldwell interrupted, rolling his eyes. "This court isn't here to solve your personal problems, Mrs. Jackson. If you can't afford your lifestyle without your husband's income, perhaps you should consider more practical solutions." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Esmeralda felt as if all the air had been sucked from her lungs. She stared at Judge Caldwell in disbelief, unable to comprehend the cruelty of his words. In the gallery, a young woman with fiery red hair shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sarah Miller, a newly minted lawyer observing the proceedings, felt her blood boil at the judge's blatant prejudice. She watched as Esmeralda's shoulders slumped in defeat, the fight visibly draining from her body. Mr. Davis, sensing victory, pounced. "Your Honor, given Mrs. Jackson's inability to present any credible evidence, we move for an immediate dismissal of this frivolous lawsuit." Judge Caldwell nodded, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm inclined to agree, Mr. Davis. Mrs. Jackson, unless you have something of actual substance to present to this court, I see no reason to waste any more of our time." Esmeralda's lips trembled as she struggled to form words. The photograph in her hands blurred as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My children need justice for their father. We need—" "What you need," Judge Caldwell interrupted coldly, "is to accept reality and move on. This court is not here to coddle you or indulge your fantasies of conspiracy." Case dismissed. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Esmeralda flinched, her legs giving out beneath her. She sank into her chair, burying her face in her hands as quiet sobs racked her body. Mr. Davis gathered his papers, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. He approached Esmeralda, looming over her shaking form. "I hope you've learned your lesson, Mrs. Jackson," he he hissed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Titan Corp isn't some piggy bank for you to shake down. Know your place. As the courtroom began to empty, Sarah Miller found herself unable to move. She watched as Esmeralda slowly gathered her things, her movements mechanical and lifeless. Without thinking, Sarah stood and made her way to the distraught woman. Mrs. Jackson, she said softly, touching Esmeralda's arm. I'm Sarah Miller. I'm a lawyer, and I couldn't help but overhear. What happened here today wasn't right. Esmeralda looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. It doesn't matter now, she murmured. It's over. They won. Sarah's jaw clenched. It's not over, she insisted. Not if you don't want it to be. I believe you, Mrs. Jackson, and I want to help. For the first time since the judge's ruling, a flicker of hope sparked in Esmeralda's eyes. You do? Sarah nodded firmly. I do. And I think there's more to this case than meets the eye. If you'll let me, I'd like to represent you. Pro bono. Esmeralda hesitated, fear and uncertainty warring with desperate hope on her face. I don't know. I can't afford to get my hopes up again. My children. Your children deserve justice, Sarah finished gently. And so do you. Let me help you fight for it. After a long moment, Esmeralda nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Okay, she whispered. Okay. As the two women left the courtroom together, neither noticed Mr. Davis watching them from the shadows. His eyes narrowed in calculation. Outside, Sarah led Esmeralda to a nearby cafe, determined to get a full account of the case away from prying eyes and ears. As they settled into a quiet corner booth, Esmeralda's hands shook as she clutched her coffee mug. I don't understand, she murmured, her voice trembling. How could the judge be so cruel? It's like he didn't even see me as a person. Sarah's expression darkened. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon. Some judges, they forget that behind every case, there are real people with real pain. But that's why we can't give up. We have to make them see. Esmeralda nodded slowly, taking a sip of her coffee. I keep thinking about Maya and David. They've already lost their father. Now, we might lose our home. I don't know how to explain to them that the people who were supposed to help us just didn't care. Sarah reached across the table, squeezing Esmeralda's hand. We're going to change that. Now, tell me everything. Start from the beginning. As Esmeralda recounted the details of the accident and the subsequent investigation, Sarah listened intently, her sharp mind picking up on inconsistencies and potential leads. She jotted down notes, her brow furrowing as a pattern began to emerge. Mrs. Jackson, she interrupted gently, you mentioned that the police report seemed off. Can you elaborate on that? Esmeralda nodded, her eyes distant as she recalled the details. The officer who came to our house, Officer Johnson, he seemed troubled, like he wanted to say more but couldn't. And when I got the official report, some of the witness statements didn't match what I'd been told at the scene. Sarah's pen paused mid-sentence. That's interesting. Very interesting. Mrs. Jackson, I think our first step should be to re-examine all the evidence. There might be something we missed. As they continued to talk, neither woman noticed the man in a dark suit who had entered the cafe. He sat at a nearby table, his back to them, but his posture was tense, his head tilted slightly as if straining to hear their conversation. After finalizing their plans to meet the next day and begin their investigation in earnest, Sarah and Esmeralda parted ways. As Sarah gathered her notes, a shadow fell across the table. She looked up to find Mr. Davis looming over her, his expression cold and menacing. Ms. Miller, is it? He said, his voice low and threatening. I couldn't help but notice your interference in today's proceedings. Sarah stood, refusing to be intimidated. I was merely offering my professional services to a client in need, Mr. Davis. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. Davis's lips curled into a sneer. Let me give you some free advice, little girl. You're playing a game you don't understand. Titan Corp isn't some small-time operation you can bully with your bleeding heart routine. Back off now, or I'll make sure your budding career is over before it begins. Sarah met his gaze steadily, her voice calm but steel-edged. Is that a threat, Mr. Davis? Consider it a friendly warning, he replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. For your own sake, Walk away. With that, he turned and strode out of the cafe, leaving Sarah standing alone, her heart pounding, but her resolve stronger than ever. That night, as Sarah pored over the case files in her small apartment, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her breath caught as she read the message. Parking garage, 42nd and Main, 30 minutes. Come alone if you want the truth. Sarah hesitated, her finger hovering over the delete button. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, that she was in over her head. But then she thought of Esmeralda's tear-stained face, of Maya and David losing their father and their home. With a deep breath, she grabbed her keys and headed out into the night. The parking garage was dimly lit and eerily quiet as Sarah's footsteps echoed through the concrete structure. Her hand clutched her pepper spray, her eyes darting to every shadow. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a pillar, and Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. "Officer Johnson," she gasped, recognizing the man from Esmeralda's description. The police officer looked haggard, his eyes darting nervously. "Ms. Miller," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for the cloak and dagger routine, but I couldn't risk being seen talking to you openly." Sarah's mind raced. "You're the one who texted me? Why? What's going on?" Johnson ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Because this case, it's not what it seems. There's something rotten here, Ms. Miller. Something big, and they're trying to bury it, along with the truth about Marcus Jackson's death." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small flash drive. "Everything I could find is on here. Witness statements that were altered, maintenance records that disappeared, security camera footage that was accidentally erased. It's not much, but it's a start." Sarah took the drive with trembling fingers. "Why are you doing this? Why now?" Johnson's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of shame and determination. "Because I became a cop to help people, not to be a pawn in some corporate cover-up. And because Esmeralda Jackson and her kids deserve better than what they got today in that courtroom." As Sarah clutched the flash drive, a new sense of purpose flooded through her. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, possibly dangerous. But in that moment, she vowed to see this through, no matter the cost. For Esmeralda, for Marcus, and for justice itself. Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard, her eyes darting between the screen and the flash drive Officer Johnson had given her. The contents were explosive, altered witness statements, missing maintenance records, and a trail of emails hinting at a cover-up that reached the highest levels of Titan Corporation. As she pieced together the puzzle, a chill ran down her spine. This was bigger than she'd imagined. A sharp knock at her office door jolted her from her focus. Sarah quickly minimized the windows on her screen, her heart racing. "Come in," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. Her assistant, a nervous young man named Tim, poked his head in. "Ms. Miller? There's a courier here with an urgent delivery for you. Says it's from Judge Caldwell's office." Sarah's brow furrowed. "Judge Caldwell? That's unusual. Send them in, please." Moments later, a stone-faced courier handed her a sealed envelope. Sarah's stomach twisted as she read its contents, her face paling with each line. "By order of Judge Thomas Caldwell," she murmured, "Esmeralda Jackson and her legal counsel are hereby prohibited from speaking publicly about the ongoing case against Titan Corp. Under penalty of contempt of court." She looked up at Tim, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a gag order." As the implications sank in, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was Esmeralda, her voice thick with tears. "Sarah, I just got an eviction notice. We have to be out by the end of the month. What are we going to do?" Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. "We'll figure something out, Esmeralda. I promise. Can you come to my office? We need to talk about some new developments." An hour later, Esmeralda sat across from Sarah, her eyes red-rimmed and haunted. Sarah explained the gag order and the evidence she'd uncovered, watching as hope and despair warred on Esmeralda's face. "So, we can't even tell people what's really happening?" Esmeralda asked, her voice cracking. "They're just going to get away with this?" Sarah leaned forward, her jaw set with determination. "Not if I have anything to say about it. We may not be able to speak publicly, but that doesn't mean we can't keep fighting. We just have to be smarter about it." As they discussed their next moves, Neither woman noticed the sleek black car parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing the figure watching Sarah's office with cold, calculating eyes. That evening, Esmeralda trudged up the stairs to her small apartment, her body heavy with exhaustion. As she fumbled for her keys, she heard muffled sobs coming from inside. Her heart clenched as she opened the door. Maya and David sat huddled on the couch, surrounded by half-packed boxes. Maya, her face streaked with tears, looked up as Esmeralda entered. "Mommy, are we really going to have to leave our home? Where will we go?" Esmeralda's carefully constructed facade crumbled. She rushed to her children, gathering them in her arms as her own tears began to fall. "I'm so sorry, babies. I'm trying so hard to fix this. I promise I won't let anything happen to you." David, his small face scrunched with worry, asked, "Is it because Daddy's gone? Is that why we have to leave?" The innocent question shattered what was left of Esmeralda's composure. She broke down, her body shaking with sobs as she clung to her children. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over. "I'm so sorry. I'm trying to be strong for you, but I don't know if I can do this alone." As the Jackson family cried together across town, Sarah was burning the midnight oil. She examined the flash drive Officer Johnson had given her, noticing a strange symbol etched into its surface. It looked like a stylized eye within a triangle, unlike any corporate logo she'd ever seen. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the diner on 5th. 20 minutes. Come alone." Gee. Sarah's pulse quickened. She grabbed her coat and headed out, her mind racing with possibilities. The diner was nearly empty when she arrived. In a back booth, Officer Johnson sat hunched over a cup of coffee, his eyes darting nervously. Sarah slid in across from him. "What's going on?" she asked in a low voice. "Why all the secrecy?" Johnson leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't risk being seen contacting you directly. Listen, there's more to this hit and run than meets the eye. I've been digging, and I think Titan Corp is involved in something much bigger than just covering up faulty brakes." Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I can't say much here," Johnson replied, glancing around. "But be careful. These people are dangerous. They'll do anything to keep this quiet." As Johnson stood to leave, Sarah caught his arm. "Wait, what's the symbol on the flash drive? The eye in the triangle?" Johnson's face paled. "Where did you see that?" When Sarah explained, he shook his head. "I don't know what it means, but I've seen it before. In places it shouldn't be. Just watch your back, Ms. Miller. You're in deeper than you know." As Sarah drove home, her mind whirled with questions. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the car that had been following her for the past few blocks. Her heart raced as she took a series of random turns, watching in her rearview mirror as the car matched her every move. Panic rising in her throat, Sarah pulled into a busy shopping center, parking haphazardly and rushing inside. She lost herself in the crowd, her eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. After what felt like hours, she finally made it home, her hands shaking as she locked the door behind her. The next morning, Sarah strode into the offices of Titan Corp., her head held high despite the churning in her stomach. She called ahead, demanding a meeting with Mr. Davis. As she was led to his office, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Davis greeted her with a cold smile. "Ms. Miller, to what do I owe this pleasure?" Sarah met his gaze unflinchingly. "Cut the act, Davis. I know you're suppressing evidence. I know about the altered witness statements, the missing maintenance records. How long do you think you can keep this charade up?" For a moment, panic flashed in Davis's eyes before he regained his composure. "Those are serious accusations, Ms. Miller. I hope you have proof to back them up." "Oh, I have proof," Sarah bluffed, her heart pounding. "And if anything happens to me or my client, it all goes public. So why don't you tell me what's really going on?" Davis's facade cracked, just for a second, but it was enough for Sarah to see the fear beneath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he hissed. "This is bigger than you, bigger than Titan Corporation. For your own sake, drop it now." As Sarah turned to leave, Davis called after her, his voice laced with desperation. "The truck driver. Did you ever wonder why he disappeared?" Sarah froze, her hand on the doorknob. She turned slowly, her voice barely audible. "What did you say?" Davis's face was ashen. "Forget I said anything. Just be careful, Ms. Miller. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed." As Sarah left the Titan Corp building, her mind reeling from the encounter, she didn't notice the figure watching her from a nearby alley. The man pulled out his phone, speaking in hushed tones. "She knows too much. Take care of it." That night, as Sarah pored over her notes, connecting the dots between the flash drive, Officer Johnson's warnings, and Davis's cryptic message, a notification popped up on her computer. An email from an anonymous sender with a single attachment. Her hands trembling, Sarah opened the file. It was a grainy video, clearly from a security camera. She watched in horror as a man she recognized as the missing truck driver argued heatedly with Robert King, Titan Corp CEO. The audio was muffled, but she could make out phrases like "cover up" and "won't stay quiet." As the argument escalated, King made a sharp gesture. Two men appeared from off-screen, grabbing the truck driver. The last frame showed them dragging him away, his face contorted in terror. Sarah sat back, her breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't just about a hit and run anymore. This was murder. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Sarah's phone rang. It was Esmeralda, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "Sarah? I think someone's been following me, and I found this strange symbol drawn on my door this morning. An eye and a triangle. What's going on?" Sarah's blood ran cold. "The same symbol from the flash drive. Esmeralda, listen to me carefully. Pack a bag for you and the kids. Don't tell anyone where you're going. I'm coming to get you now." As she hung up, Sarah's mind raced. They were in too deep now to back out. Whatever Titan Corp was hiding, it was worth killing for. And now, she and Esmeralda were squarely in their crosshairs. Sarah grabbed her keys, her heart pounding. She had to get to Esmeralda and her children before it was too late. As she rushed out the door, she didn't notice the dark figure watching from across the street, a phone pressed to their ear. "They're on the move. What are your orders?" The chase was on, and the stakes had never been higher. Sarah knew that the next few hours would determine not just the outcome of their case, but possibly their very survival. As she sped through the night towards Esmeralda's apartment, she silently vowed to see this through, no matter the cost. For justice, for Marcus's memory, and for the truth that someone was willing to kill to keep hidden. Sarah's phone buzzed incessantly as she paced her cramped office, her eyes darting between the stack of case files and the ticking clock on the wall. Judge Caldwell's voice, cold and dismissive, echoed in her mind. "Final hearing set for next Friday. I suggest you come prepared, Ms. Miller, or this case will be dismissed with prejudice." She had less than a week to build an airtight case against Titan Corp, a behemoth with seemingly endless resources and a web of influence that stretched far beyond the courtroom. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached for her coffee mug, only to find it empty for the third time that morning. A soft knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Esmeralda stood in the doorway, her eyes rimmed with red and her shoulders slumped in defeat. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I lost my job. The supervisor said I've been too distracted, missing too many shifts. I don't know what to do." Sarah's heart sank. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides, enveloping Esmeralda in a fierce hug. "We'll figure this out," she murmured, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "We're close to something big. I can feel it." Esmeralda pulled away, her eyes searching Sarah's face. "But at what cost? My children are terrified. We're about to be homeless, and now I can't even provide for them. Maybe we should just take whatever settlement Titan Corp offers and try to move on." Sarah's jaw clenched. "No," she said firmly. "We can't let them win like this. Your husband deserves justice, and so do you. Give me one more day. I have a lead I need to follow up on." As Esmeralda nodded reluctantly and left, Sarah's phone buzzed again. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Her pulse quickening, she answered, "Hello." A gruff voice spoke quickly, corner of 5th and Main, 1 hour. "Come alone if you want the truth about the truck." The line went dead. Sarah's mind raced. This could be the break they needed, or a trap. She grabbed her coat and keys, scribbling a hasty note for her assistant before rushing out the door. The garage on 5th and Main was a dilapidated structure, its rusted sign barely legible in the fading afternoon light. Sarah's footsteps echoed ominously as she entered, her hand clutching her pepper spray. "Hello," she called out, her voice bouncing off the concrete walls. A figure emerged from the shadows, a wiry man in oil-stained coveralls. His eyes darted nervously as he approached. "You the lawyer?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Sarah nodded, studying him carefully. "And you are?" "Name's Frank. I was a mechanic on duty the night that Titan Corp truck came in, the one that killed your client's husband." He paused, swallowing hard. "What they're saying about faulty brakes. It's true, but it's worse than that." Sarah leaned in, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Frank's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Those brakes didn't just fail. They were tampered with. I saw the damage myself, and it wasn't no accident. But when I tried to report it, my supervisor shut me down, said if I knew what was good for me, I'd keep my mouth shut and falsify the maintenance records." Sarah's mind whirled with the implications. "Frank, this is huge. Would you be willing to testify?" A sharp crack echoed through the garage, cutting her off mid-sentence. Frank's eyes widened in shock as he stumbled forward, revealing a growing red stain on his back. Sarah screamed, instinctively dropping to the ground as more shots rang out. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she crawled behind a nearby car, her eyes scanning frantically for the source of the gunfire. In the distance, she heard the screech of tires as a vehicle sped away. With shaking hands, Sarah dialed 911, her voice cracking as she reported the shooting. As sirens wailed in the distance, she crawled back to Frank, pressing her jacket against his wound in a desperate attempt to stem the bleeding. "Hold on," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Help is coming. Just hold on." Frank's eyes flickered open, his breathing labored. "Don't let them win," he gasped before his body went limp in Sarah's arms. Hours later, Sarah sat in a sterile police interrogation room, her clothes still stained with Frank's blood. Officer Johnson paced before her, his face etched with concern. "Ms. Miller, do you understand the gravity of what's happening here?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't just about a hit and run anymore. We're talking about corporate conspiracy, tampering with evidence, and now murder." Sarah nodded numbly, her mind still reeling from the day's events. "I understand, but we can't back down now. Not when we're so close to the truth." Johnson sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I've been doing some digging of my own. The symbol you found on that flash drive? It's connected to something called Project Oversight. I don't know what it is, but it goes way beyond Titan Corporation. We're talking government contracts, black ops budgets. This is big league stuff." Sarah's eyes widened as the pieces began to fall into place. So Titan Corp isn't just covering up negligence. They're protecting something much bigger. Johnson nodded grimly. "And they're willing to kill to keep it quiet. You need to be careful, Sarah. These people, they play for keeps." As Sarah left the police station, her mind whirling with new information and fresh fears, she didn't notice the sleek black car that pulled out behind her, following at a discreet distance. The next morning, Sarah stood before Judge Caldwell, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on her. "Your Honor, in light of recent events, we request a postponement of the final hearing. New evidence has come to light that—" Judge Caldwell cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Ms. Miller, I've indulged your fishing expedition long enough. This court's time is valuable, and I won't have it wasted on wild conspiracy theories and unsubstantiated claims." Sarah's jaw clenched. "With all due respect, Your Honor, a man was murdered yesterday, a key witness in this case. Surely that warrants—" "Enough!" Caldwell's gavel crashed down, silencing the murmurs that had rippled through the courtroom. "I've made my decision. The hearing will proceed as scheduled. And Ms. Miller, I warn you, if you don't have concrete, admissible evidence to present, I will not only dismiss this case, but also recommend sanctions against you for wasting this court's time." As Sarah turned to leave, her eyes met Mr. Davis's across the courtroom. The Titan Corp lawyer's smug smile sent a chill down her spine. Outside, Esmeralda waited, her face a mask of worry. What happened? What did the judge say? Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. We're running out of time, Esmeralda. But I promise you, I won't let them get away with this. We're going to find the truth, no matter what it takes. As they walked away from the courthouse, neither woman noticed the figure watching them from a nearby rooftop, a high-powered camera lens trained on their every move. That night, Sarah worked feverishly in her office, poring over every scrap of evidence they'd gathered. The pieces were there, she knew it. She just had to find a way to connect them all before it was too late. A sharp knock at her door made her jump. She opened it cautiously, revealing Officer Johnson, his face grim. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past her into the office. "I've been suspended. They're saying I've been leaking confidential information, interfering with an ongoing investigation." Sarah's heart sank. "They're trying to silence you too." Johnson nodded, his eyes haunted. "It's worse than we thought, Sarah. I managed to get access to some classified files before they shut me out. Titan Corp isn't just a company. It's a front for a massive Black Ops program. The trucks, the shipping contracts, it's all a cover for moving weapons, experimental tech, God knows what else." Sarah's mind reeled with the implications. So Marcus's death was no accident, Johnson finished. He saw something he shouldn't have, and they silenced him. And now they're trying to bury the whole thing. A crash from outside made them both jump. Sarah rushed to the window, her blood running cold at the sight of two men in dark clothing approaching the building. "We need to go," Johnson said urgently, drawing his weapon. "Now!" They rushed down the back stairs, Sarah clutching her laptop with all their evidence. As they burst out into the alley behind the building, headlights suddenly blinded them. A van screeched to a halt, blocking their path. Sarah's heart pounded as masked figures emerged from the van. She turned to run, only to find their escape cut off by more men approaching from behind. Johnson raised his gun, shouting, "Police! Stand down!" A shot rang out, and Johnson crumpled to the ground. Sarah screamed as rough hands grabbed her, a cloth pressed against her face. As darkness closed in, her last thought was of Esmeralda and the promise she'd made to find justice for Marcus. When Sarah awoke, she found herself in a dimly lit room, her hands bound behind her back. As her vision cleared, she saw a figure sitting across from her, Robert King, CEO of Titan Corp. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice cold and calculating, "I'm afraid you've become quite a problem for us. But I'm here to offer you a choice. Walk away now, forget everything you've learned, and we'll make sure you and Mrs. Jackson are well compensated for your inconvenience." Sarah's eyes narrowed, defiance burning through her fear. "And if I refuse?" King's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then I'm afraid this becomes a much more unpleasant conversation. For both of us." As Sarah weighed her options, knowing that her next words could determine not just the outcome of the case, but possibly her very survival, she thought of Marcus, of Esmeralda and her children, of Frank the mechanic and Officer Johnson. She thought of all the lives destroyed by Titan Corp's greed and corruption. Taking a deep breath, Sarah met King's gaze unflinchingly. "I'll see you in court," she said, her voice steady and resolute. King's face hardened. "I was afraid you'd say that." "Very well, Ms. Miller. Let the games begin." As King left the room, Sarah's mind raced. She had less than 24 hours until the final hearing, and the stakes had never been higher. Somehow, she had to find a way to expose the truth, bring down Titan Corp, and make it out alive. The clock was ticking, and Sarah knew that the next day would determine not just the outcome of their case, but the fate of everyone involved in this web of lies and corruption. As she worked to free herself from her bonds, Sarah silently vowed to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. For justice, for truth, and for all those who had been silenced along the way. Esmeralda Jackson stood in the dimly lit hallway of the courthouse, her shoulders slumped under the weight of despair. The polished marble floors reflected her distorted image, a fitting metaphor for how twisted and unrecognizable her life had become. She clutched a crumpled eviction notice in one hand and her phone in the other, her thumb hovering over Sarah Miller's number. With a deep breath that seemed to drain the last remnants of her hope, Esmeralda pressed call. Sarah's voice, usually so full of determination, sounded strained. Esmeralda, are you okay? I can't do this anymore, Sarah, Esmeralda whispered, her voice cracking. We're about to be homeless. My children are terrified. And for what? We're fighting against people who can make a man disappear, who can kill to keep their secrets. She paused, swallowing hard. I'm giving up. I'm going to take whatever settlement they offer and try to rebuild our lives. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. When Sarah finally spoke, her words carried a mix of understanding and fierce resolve. Esmeralda, listen to me. I know you're scared. I am too. But we're so close to exposing the truth. If we give up now, Marcus's death will have been for nothing. And Titan Corp will keep hurting people, destroying lives. We can't let that happen. Esmeralda closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. But at what cost, Sarah? I can't risk my children's safety. I can't. A commotion at the end of the hallway cut her off. Sarah's voice became urgent. Esmeralda, where are you? At the courthouse. I was going to tell Judge Caldwell we're dropping the case. Stay there, Sarah commanded. I'm on my way. Whatever you do, don't talk to anyone, especially not Caldwell or Davis. The line went dead, leaving Esmeralda standing alone in the echoing hallway, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a tiny, rekindled spark of hope. 30 minutes later, Sarah burst through the courthouse doors, her hair disheveled and her eyes wild with a combination of exhaustion and fierce determination. She spotted Esmeralda and rushed over, grabbing her hands. We're going into that courtroom, Sarah said, her voice low and intense, and we're going to end this. Once and for all. Esmeralda searched Sarah's face, seeing the bruises and cuts that hadn't been there the day before. Sarah, what happened to you? Are you? There's no time, Sarah cut her off, already pulling her towards the courtroom. Just trust me. Can you do that? After a moment's hesitation, Esmeralda nodded. Together, they pushed open the heavy wooden doors and strode into the courtroom. Judge Caldwell looked up from his bench, his eyebrows rising in surprise. Ms. Miller, Mrs. Jackson, I wasn't expecting you until… Your Honor, Sarah interrupted, her voice ringing out clear and strong. We request an immediate hearing. New evidence has come to light that demands the court's immediate attention. Mr. Davis jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. We haven't been notified of any new evidence. Judge Caldwell's eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah. Ms. Miller, I hope for your sake that this isn't another wild goose chase. You're already skating on thin ice. Sarah met his gaze unflinchingly. I assure you, Your Honor, what I'm about to present will change everything. The judge hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Proceed. Sarah took a deep breath, then launched into her presentation. She laid out the evidence of the tampered brakes, the falsified maintenance records, the mysterious disappearance of the truck driver. With each revelation, the courtroom grew more tense, the air thick with shocked murmurs and gasps. Mr. Davis repeatedly objected, his face growing redder by the minute, but Sarah pressed on relentlessly. She detailed the web of corruption that stretched from Titan Corp to the highest levels of government, the Black Ops program hidden behind a veneer of corporate legitimacy. As she spoke, Esmeralda watched the faces in the courtroom. She saw shock, disbelief, and growing anger. But it was Judge Caldwell's expression that caught her attention. The man's usual arrogant demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a sickly pallor and a sheen of sweat on his brow. Finally, Sarah paused, her eyes scanning the room. Your Honor, members of the court, what I've presented so far is damning. But there's one more piece of evidence that ties it all together. She pulled out a small recorder and pressed play. The voice that filled the courtroom was unmistakably Judge Caldwell's. King, you assured me this would be handled discreetly. If this gets out, we're both finished. My son, Robert King's voice cut in smooth and cold. Your son is safe, Thomas. As long as you do your part, to make sure this case goes away permanently. The recording ended, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. All eyes turned to Judge Caldwell, who sat frozen, his face a mask of shock and fear. Mr. Davis leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, this is clearly a fabrication. I'm moved to have this so-called evidence struck from the record," and the courtroom doors burst open, cutting him off. Officer Johnson strode in, flanked by several uniformed officers. "Robert King, Jason Caldwell, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, corporate negligence, and conspiracy to commit murder." As the officers moved to apprehend King and Caldwell, chaos erupted in the courtroom. Reporters who had been quietly observing the proceedings now shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the air filled with a cacophony of voices. In the midst of the pandemonium, Sarah turned to Esmeralda, her eyes shining with tears of relief and triumph. "It's over," she whispered. "We did it." Esmeralda stood in stunned silence, watching as the men who had caused her so much pain were led away in handcuffs. She felt a tug on her sleeve and looked down to see Maya and David, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. "Mommy," Maya asked, her eyes wide. "Is it true? Did they find out who hurt Daddy?" Esmeralda knelt down, gathering her children in her arms. "Yes, baby," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "They did, and they're going to make sure it never happens to anyone else." As the initial chaos subsided, the newly appointed judge called for order. He turned to Esmeralda, his expression solemn. "Mrs. Jackson, on behalf of this court and the justice system that has failed you so grievously, I offer my deepest apologies. While we cannot undo the tragedy you've suffered, we can ensure that justice is served. Titan Corp will be held fully accountable for their actions, and you will be compensated for your losses." Esmeralda nodded, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. She felt Sarah's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "Your Honor," Sarah said, "if I may, I believe Mrs. Jackson has something she'd like to say." Esmeralda looked at Sarah in surprise, but as their eyes met, she felt a surge of strength. She stood, facing the court with her head held high. "Thank you, Your Honor," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "What happened here today is bigger than just my family. It's about every person who's ever been wronged by those in power, every voice that's been silenced, every life that's been destroyed by corporate greed." She paused, looking down at her children, then back up at the rapt faces in the courtroom. "My husband Marcus was a good man. He believed in justice and standing up for what's right. I couldn't save him, but today, we honored his memory by exposing the truth." Esmeralda's gaze swept the room, landing finally on Sarah. "This victory isn't just for us. It's for every family who's lost a loved one to negligence and corruption. It's for every worker who's been forced to choose between their safety and their livelihood. And it's for every person who's ever felt powerless in the face of injustice." She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I can't bring Marcus back, but I can make sure his death wasn't in vain. From this day forward, I pledge to fight for those who can't fight for themselves, to be a voice for the voiceless, because that's what Marcus would have wanted. That's the legacy I want to leave for our children." As Esmeralda finished speaking, a hush fell over the courtroom. Then, slowly, people began to stand. The applause started softly, then grew into a thunderous ovation. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Cameras flashed, and in that moment, Esmeralda felt the weight of her grief begin to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose and resolve. Later, as they left the courthouse, Esmeralda, Sarah, and the children stepped out into the bright sunlight. The street was lined with reporters and well-wishers, all clamoring for a statement or a photo. Esmeralda knelt down to Maya and David's level. "You know," she said softly, "your daddy would be so proud of us today. We didn't just win a case. We changed things. We made the world a little bit better." Maya's eyes shone with tears and pride. "Can we do more, Mommy? Can we help other people like us?" Esmeralda looked up at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, baby," Esmeralda said, her voice filled with newfound determination. "That's exactly what we're going to do." As they walked down the courthouse steps, hand in hand, Esmeralda felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since Marcus's death. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in months, she felt hope. Hope for justice, hope for change, and hope for a future where her children could grow up in a world a little fairer and more just than the one they'd inherited. The sun warm on her face, Esmeralda stepped forward into that future, ready to honor Marcus's memory by continuing the fight for justice, one case at a time.